Yeah, while I'm getting going, my name is Jeff. It's nice to meet you. I'm going to be talking about weekly UX research today. If you can't ever hear me, please put it in the chat. I'm going to be watching the chat very, very closely because of these issues. And I'm going to ask you a few times to put stuff in the chat. So let's go ahead and start that. So great, you can hear me. Awesome. So I want to know, what's your big struggle with research? Just to get started a little bit and kind of get an idea of where you're at, comfortable with the chat. It really helps me when you type in the chat as well. A little bit of interaction goes a long way when you're giving a talk in a kind of setup like this. So yeah, I'd love to know, what's your big struggle with research? And I'm guessing many of you are here because you think that weekly UX research could help you out. And I agree. So yeah, put that in the chat. What's your big struggle with research? While you're putting that in the chat, just an overview of the talk today. I made a little bit.ly here, so you can go to this link, and I have a much longer talk that this is based on, so it's 60 minutes, and I also include tons and tons of resources. So everything I mentioned in this talk will be at that link. You can put your email in there, and then you'll get like a YouTube recording of an hour on a whole masterclass on how to do weekly UX research, and then a bunch of resources. So I did this about a year ago, so you can access that whenever you want. If you're wanting the recording immediately or anything like that, you can access that later. You can decide after this talk if you want to learn more, and it's always there. So just letting you know that. Okay, so I'm getting some people in here saying that identifying the problem, big one. I think that's a good place to start here for this whole talk. Getting the stakeholders on the same page. I like this to get people to test the UX, getting everybody involved on the same page. I already see some collaboration here, which I think is going to be a key aspect that I want to talk about today. So that's good. That's 4 entries. One more. Thanks, Tom. How to define a UX research plan and a campaign. And then Judy is saying repository for weekly research insights. That's really cool. Super advanced there. Getting UX and PM to incorporate testing in a design sprint and tools to use for weekly UX. Very specific. Thanks for that, Judy. Nikki's saying, when working on a case study from the beginning, where and how to get to the users. Getting comprehensive feedback. Okay. So it's kind of all over the place here, and I'm seeing a lot of different levels. Some really specific things like research repositories. Some just like wanting to get in touch with users. I know that there's quite a few UX researchers in this talk, hopefully, also even some CEOs. So I want to address a pretty broad side of this. And I'm pretty excited here because I generally work with product designers, product leaders, product teams. So it's going to be kind of cool to talk with some more UX researchers and CEOs. So I really appreciate you putting your opinions here in the comments, and we'll keep interacting with those. So where I came at this originally, where I came at weekly research, was I was trying to get more research done. I found myself in kind of a design leadership position, and it was a startup. And what I really wanted to do was improve the product, and I really wanted to put into action kind of set up processes for getting the user involved in what we did. And this is here a screenshot of non-designers working in a team. This was pretty early. They were, getting involved with affinity mapping, and they were interested in interviewing. And there was a kind of a good energy. People were willing to work in UX, and so it was the perfect time because the company was interested in it. They were all aligned with doing this, and I was able to kind of take some control there. And so I was like, how will I do this? How will I get people talking to users? And that's where I first came at this and tried a few things that didn't work. And then my boss had the first good idea that started down this path was just like, why don't you do monthly user testing sessions? And so I started to set up something more on the calendar. And no matter what is happening, that one time of the month, we would try and get users into the office and talk to them. We let lots of people interact with them. We put lots of stuff in front of them. But I think that little time box window was the first time that I started to realize the power of regularity, of continuity. And that became what I'll talk about today, which is weekly UX research. And this is where a lot of people are starting from. If we have data, let's look at data. If all we have are opinions, let's go with mine. Classic mindset from CEO there. I love this quote because this is the reality. This is what will happen at your companies if you're not getting a lot of user feedback. So yeah, you're going to go with the highest paid person's opinion if there is no data. And what we're really trying to do here is infuse our work with more data. And when I talk about data in this talk from now on, I'm going to be talking about data. I mean qualitative and quantitative. I think they're both extremely useful sides of data. So how do we get data to people? That's a really big part of what's behind weekly research. So this is what we're trying to do. I want to focus on this aspect of user research, product discovery, UX research, whatever you want to call it. I think this infuse our decisions. This is something that you'll hear a lot of product leaders, executives, CEOs talk about, because they're making decisions and they need help doing that. They need support. They need data to do that. And then from the UX research side, I really like to talk about the user's perspective and the user's behaviors as being really important. So this is one area that I wanted to start with, is infuse our decisions. And I think this is kind of a bit of a new language that you hear people talking about researching users and doing research at companies. They'll start talking about improving decision making. And I like that as well. I think it really talks about the ultimate end goal. And it's cool because it gets outside of the person doing the research's perspective even. So it's not always the person doing the research that is making the decisions, especially in the traditional classic model of doing user research. So how do we infuse our decisions? We all do this. We all make decisions. We all turn around. We look at Post-its. We think about what we're doing. We talk, we collaborate, and we end up making decisions. And this is something that's been happening a lot more on product teams. You've really seen a rise in in-house teams where you're kind of multidisciplinary people working in small teams of like less than 7, trying to harness the power of the startup to create really interesting products that are focused on customers. And you see this kind of trend going along where you're getting a little bit more collaboration when it comes to making decisions. So infusing our decisions, just making better ones, using data to do that, and making sure that we feel confident in what we're deciding to do. Designers do this, product managers do this, everyone makes decisions. So we need to understand what to make those decisions. And that would be the user's perspective, first of all. And this may be new to you if you're not getting into a lot of UX research, if you're maybe a CEO and you're trying to make your company better, make your product more specific and more kind of tailored to a customer, then the user's perspective becomes really important. And this is, when it's new, it's in balance to perhaps the business perspective, which is always very ever present at companies. The business perspective is what we're trying to do. It's the internal, dialogue about what we're doing as a company. But sometimes businesses really ignore the user's perspective. And I think a good example of this is the Amazon Fire Phone. So I like to use this as an example of what happens when you ignore the user's perspective, because all the kind of press that's come out about this phone and the process that went into making it shows a real lack of understanding of customers. Even some of the founding members of this team, they said that from the beginning, this was just Jeff Bezos' baby. This was something that it was his pet project, really wanted to get this thing through. And he had some personal reasons and some personal perspective on why he wanted that. Mainly that he was paying 30% on all purchases to his store made through the iPhone, because that's something that Apple requires. If you make a purchase on the iPhone, you're having to pay 30% of that to Apple. He didn't like that. That was a problem of Jeff Bezos. So he made a solution. He tried to solve it. And a solution wasn't necessarily based on the user's perspective or their problems. It was more on Amazon's problems and Jeff Bezos' financial problems there. So that's the approach that we would say we try to avoid. They tried to do some research, but they ended up just with a very sort of technical solution. They were adding things like 3D rendering and a lot of stuff that wasn't necessarily coming from the customer. Like the market isn't quite ready still for 3D rendering features on phone. You don't see that. That's something they were really trying to go for. And what I see here is just a clear lack of empathy for the customer and what they want. Amazon is pretty good about offering like low prices and the cheapest possible experience for the customer. Generally, they're pretty good. But for whatever reason, in this example, they kind of neglected that user's perspective, and they paid for it to the tune of $170 million. That's how much it cost them. So that's a quick example of how the user's perspective can be really helpful, and try not to avoid it. And then the third thing here is the user's behavior. So more than just the perspective, it's even more important to understand what the user is doing. We need to make sure that it's not just them saying, hey, I want this, I like this, and then we give it to them. That doesn't always work so well. Us UX researchers know that you can't just give people what they like and they want. They usually, don't even know that quite yet. And you have to kind of pull it out of them. If it was as easy as asking people what they wanted and like, you wouldn't really need a UX researcher. You wouldn't need anyone doing research. You just sort of run a poll and build exactly what they want. But that's not the reality. What people's behaviors do often doesn't align with what they're saying. And to illustrate this, there's a classic study. So maybe you've heard of this, the Yellow Walkman study. This has been talked about and discussed so much, it's almost like urban legend in the research fields. But what happened was they were trying to figure out, do the customers want this new yellow Walkman? So this is a long time ago. And they were saying, okay, let's figure out if they do. Let's do a focus group. Not one of my favorite research methods, but something they did. So they ran a focus group and they asked people, do you like this one or this one? Which one do you like? Tell us, give us your opinions. And everyone agreed that the yellow Walkman was the one that they wanted. They said, yes, we like this one. It's new. It's so different than the black, and they're giving all these reasons why they like it. But then the researchers did something really interesting. So instead of just being okay with the opinions and moving on, they put a table near the door, and they put a pile of black Walkmans and a pile of yellow Walkmans. And they said, okay, on the way out, you can have a free Walkman as a big thank you for your participation. And what happened was everyone who said they wanted a yellow Walkman ended up taking a black Walkman. No one took a yellow Walkman out of that room. They said they wanted the yellow Walkman. They were making up all kinds of reasons, maybe to make the researchers happy, or for whatever reason, groupthink, something was causing them to say that they wanted this yellow Walkman. Their behavior didn't match up with that. And I think if you can understand why that's going on, if you can understand the user's perspective, and you can understand the user's behavior, then you can get pretty far. And that's really going to help infuse your decisions. So that's really what we're trying to do with weekly research, is infuse those decisions using perspective and behavior. So just a quick overview of high level how I'm thinking about the power of UX research and why we need to start thinking about getting more of it. So there's a mindset that goes behind weekly UX research. What is that mindset? That's something worth looking at, because I think the mindset actually is changing a little bit behind how we do research, especially at product companies. And this is a thing that I made a long time ago. And if you're not used to research, if you don't know anything about research, or you're not doing it, or it's new to your company, this is going to be something that's really helpful for you. It's kind of the first step here is like, yeah, we save time if we do some upfront research. Kind of do a little checking, make sure that we know where we want to go with our approach before we start spending a lot of money on designing or even coding something. It's good to do a little bit of discovery. So your project without discovery might go through some winding things. Sure, it's you can be iterative and you can learn, but doing just a little bit of upfront discovery can go a long way and save you trouble. So that's a mindset that you'll see a lot of kind of junior UX designers and researchers, product managers. This is a mindset you'll start with, and it's a great starting point. But I want to take a look at what this looks like, this project mindset. So if we want to do a little bit of upfront discovery, then let's say we planned out a project here. So with the project mindset, we take 6 weeks of exploratory research. We don't know what we want to do yet. We don't want to make sure we don't develop code the wrong thing. Let's do some exploratory research. So let's say I do that. 6 weeks, and then what happens? Well, you get this little report. This is a really key deliverable that you'll have with a lot of user researchers, UX researchers. It's a report, and it tells you what they learned. If you're someone who's higher up, your CEO, maybe you got invited to a meeting where someone presented something like that. If you're a researcher, then you've probably made several of these things. And what you kind of business leaders don't know is there's a pain behind that us UX researchers feel. Nobody reads. Nobody reads your report. You spend all this time. You try everything you can. You try and sell it internally, but nobody's reading your report. And it's just you spending all this effort, putting everything into this beautiful PDF, this like perfect summary with tons of insights that everyone needs, but nobody wants. This is the reality behind being a UX researcher at an organization. Nobody reads it. People don't care. This is something that we're overcoming, but this is kind of the old school approach to UX research, where it was these giant documents. These things are changing, of course, but it still is this moment here where we try and present, share, and help others understand what we've been learning. So, okay, you've done that. You've done 6 weeks of research, and you've handed it over, in a sense, to the design and development team. Then they get to work. So they got the report, they start working for another 6 weeks. And then at this point, you say, okay, can we launch? Is it possible? Can we do that? Should we? And you get the green light, so you say, cool, we're going to launch. And then research, potentially, not always, but sometimes research begins again, where you do evaluative research. So maybe you would run some kind of product analytics numbers, maybe you do some A/B testing, and you try to figure out and validate what you've done already. Say okay, did this meet the expectations that we wanted? So the final stage there, you started with some exploratory research, you did some work, and then you did some evaluative research, and then you get another report, right, saying how well it did. Maybe this is a little bit more quantitative focused, whereas the one from before was a little bit more qualitative. But either way, you're reporting to the leadership and to people involved how things did. And in a sense, this would be even a bit oversimplistic, but kind of an ideal view of what UX research, user research might look like at many companies. And this is still in this project mindset. So yeah, you've got this moment here to learn a little bit if you're not a researcher, and then you have a moment there to learn a bit if you're not a researcher. So if you're a designer and a developer, you get 2 potential options to learn something to improve your work. And if you're a researcher, you get 2 tries to understand better about how to make this thing go. But the real kind of dirty secret here is that most teams never get to a V2, especially when the work looks like this. And if this is how your team is structuring their work, I want to show it to you just a little bit differently. You're getting the idea here. Do you see what's happening with the work? Here is a very subtle hint to let you see what I think is happening behind this structure. So when you set up your work like this, what's happening is you're working in a bit of a waterfall approach. And that means there's a handover as each specialist kind of hands over the work they're doing, and they have to kind of explain what's happening next, and they move forward. And that can sometimes cause bottlenecks, and it can cause a lot of issues for reasons that we probably know, because many of us work in a more agile mindset. Thanks, Judy. It's a little bit delayed, but Judy's screaming, waterfall, baby. Appreciate it. Yeah, so that's kind of the old school way. And I wouldn't necessarily say that this is how most companies are running, but I would challenge you to think about your company now. Does it look something like this? Or is there something a little bit more continuous, a little bit more weekly, a little bit more agile? I would challenge many people who think that this looks nothing like their practice, that actually it does look like this. It is really hard to avoid this. And I think that's actually one of the main draws behind weekly research, if you understand the background. And this is kind of how I see what we're trying to do better than. This is the starting point. And this is okay. I don't want to trash talk this too much, because this really works for agencies. This model is kind of built around how agencies might outsource their research to somebody else. And then what can you do? You're kind of stuck in this project mindset. But you have this one expert usually. Maybe it's a few, but usually it's just like one UX researcher that gets this really deep insight. And this deep insight comes from their own background, their life experience, maybe their hobbies. Probably can't read this, but this is just saying all the things that make up the frame that they look at research with, which is their background, their life. And they add some meaning upon this. They try to be as unbiased as possible, and they try and present you with the truth here. But there's always going to be their own frame upon it. It's impossible to avoid. There's many biases in research, and I think even UX researchers are the most aware of their own biases. So this is the way that we can move forward. So if we want to improve that, how can we make that a little bit better? So here is a week of work, and I use this as an example to talk about the potential of what might happen if you're doing weekly research. So let's just look at this calendar. 3 hours of work here. So what's going on? We've got 15 minutes where we send out some product surveys on Monday. We start a user test on some unmoderated user test program. Maybe we do a little bit of desk research on Tuesday between a meeting. We have our one weekly interview on Wednesday. We do a little team debrief with the team. So there's like 2 or 3 of us involved in that. So that's the kind of the only synchronous event happening with the team. And then we might do some desk research again between a meeting here and there. And then we might review the results of that test we sent out on Monday. So there's nothing crazy here. This might be an example of weekly research. So nothing scary. You can manage this. This is just 3 hours. Those blocks are big, right? But that's just 3 hours of work. In comparison to this, you're talking about like hours and hours and hours of work. So you're not going to be able to get as much with this as the other. You're just still not putting even your full focus on it. Maybe you're just kind of doing this while you're doing other work. So you're just saying like, I can't do 3 hours or removed from my sprint. I'm not going to do this. I'm going to do this every single week. The whole team is, and we do 3 hours less of sprint work. And that's how we're going to make sure that we're getting to our research work. And I think that's a really good way to start. And as you heard me talk about the team debrief, like behind this schedule is that we're trying to be a little bit more collaborative. We're trying to make sure that we're talking through what we're learning, we're discussing it. It's not just that we're doing tons and tons of interviews and playing this weird game where we try and have the most data about customers. We're actually trying to discuss it. We're trying to learn from it. So it's working with the data, not just capturing it and gathering it. So that's kind of the behind the scenes and kind of the power of doing weekly research. And some of the things that I like about this, not only that you get it done, and not only that you make it more of a ritual and you make it more of a habit, and you try and do a little bit, try not to make it overwhelming so that you can do it every single week. I like that about it because it doesn't make me stressed. It doesn't make me procrastinate and do all this cramming, all this research that I need. So compared to this, I think that what's also nice is that you have these two big shots. You have these two big gambles. If you're a business owner, you're taking two bets that these reports are going to be good enough to make the product better. And that may be the case. You might have a really good UX researcher who can just quickly, easily figure out what's going on and easily make the team understand it. But maybe you don't. Maybe it's really tough for the team to get the expertise of the UX researcher. And maybe they don't quite understand, they don't quite learn what they need to. So they don't quite get the learning that they should. What I like about this is it's a little bit less risky. You're taking these two smaller risks. There's two moments here to generate some insights with the team. So you just kind of making it in smaller packets. So maybe on Wednesday in that debrief, we have a chance for the team to learn a bit, but they're more involved, so they don't necessarily need to be presented things. And then maybe when you're reviewing the user test results, you could also look at it. And, you could be learning as you go. And a lot of this is just a different way to organize things. It's motivated, but as you can see, by different tools that are becoming easier, ways to do remote interviews, maybe things like Miro. And I'll talk a little bit about like what's driving some of these changes in teams. But I think a nice positive of this is when you get a little bit broader insight, it certainly won't be as deep as a UX research specialist expert who's been doing it for 5 years. But I think it is good to bring the team in and get their frame. Like instead of just presenting the research, let the team come in and help make sense of that research. So do sense making with the team. Do synthesis with the team. Don't just rely on this like lecture model. Like this, me talking to you now, isn't necessarily the best way for you to learn this information. Better would be for us to like work through it together. Better would us to be like interact, and you kind of play with this a bit and you add your own thoughts to it. It's just always going to be a little bit harder. It's hard to make people, it's easy to explain things to people, but it's hard to make people understand. So sometimes explaining, doesn't go enough. And the nice thing about kind of turning around, as I said, like looking at that data with the team is you add more perspectives, you add more diversity. So your developers are probably one of your biggest assets. The way that they think about technology is often on a level of brilliance. But we don't always bring them into our process. It's a big blind spot for us designers and researchers. So I think this is this collaborative side of it can be really helpful. But yeah, I think that's just an overview. I don't have a lot of time to go into too much detail. But that's kind of why I think this is a bit of a new evolution of doing research on teams. So why now? It's not just that like, oh, somebody had the brilliant idea to figure out like what's new. Like, oh, cool, I read a book and now I suddenly did it. And the only thing stopping us before was that we didn't watch this webinar or something like that. That's not true. I think there's a lot of things that are changing along behind this. In this talk, I go through kind of the music industry as an example, and that's kind of how I start, like this story of how we were making these big giant things, these big records, and how bands would work for years on a record and then release it, and they wouldn't know if it was a good record until it came out. And that's not the case today. We have things like Spotify. We have smaller packets. We can have lots of data. We can learn as we release. And I thought it's a kind of a good metaphor for what's happening in software. But in design, we actually have some interesting stories to kind of show you why weekly research is even possible. And this screenshot here, I took, there's this thing called the Wayback Machine, where you can look up websites in the past. So I looked at Adobe's website 10 years ago, 2012. This is how they were selling their web design tool. You can see that they're talking about like the professionals. They're saying it's ideal for photographers and print designers. It's ideal for web designers, cross-media designers. Like it's ideal for everybody, right? And they had these boxes and they were selling it like that. You have once a year, you'd find the update, maybe like once every 3 years even, you would have the new thing. So it took a while, it wasn't this like continuous delivery, this continuous change that you see in software today. Like in the software that I use every day, like every day I log in and it's like, hey, want the new version? Hit refresh. Very, very different than every 3 years getting a box in the mail. So software is changing in the way that they're selling it, as well as kind of hinting at this new direction. Here's Figma today. I love this quote. This is kind of on the very top of the product page selling the software. I want my team to spend time thinking about high-level UX problems rather than mindlessly repeating busy work. Figma helps me do that. I think a lot of the things they're selling here are mindlessly busy work. Now that technology has kind of helped us overcome some of these things, we don't have to spend as much effort on the tiny little details. We can be thinking about high-level UX problems. And to me, that's also kind of code for research, understanding customers, these high-level UX problems. So I think that's really the way we're thinking about these things now, giving everybody a little bit more time to think about high-level UX problems. It's not just design tools. This is Miro. So the way we work is changing dramatically. Again, on their product page, like distributed teams, agile practices. They're talking about how teams are coming together and teams are working together. And you'll see a lot of software selling you this idea of collaboration in teams. And this is definitely not a recent trend, but you see this happening for a long time, especially since lockdown. You've got Miro, where we're now all doing our work together as a team. You've got Notion, where you're probably storing all the things you're learning. Maybe you're not using Notion, but tools like Notion, knowledge management tools, have exploded recently. And that's also made it much easier for us to share research and to have it in a centralized place. So you see a lot of these things, even getting into tools like Airtime. So Airtime does stuff like this. You've got like Dovetail. You've got tons and tons of UX research tools that are really focused on like collaborating and using that knowledge that you're gaining doing research. So it's not just one researcher presenting it to you and then that's it. That's the only chance you get. It's like, oh, well, it's more available, it's more searchable in a sort of research repository. The research repository, also, a lot of work has been done by the research ops community. This is one of my favorite developments within the research world. This really grassroots effort to help with the people, mechanisms, and strategies that set user research in motion. Now, if you haven't checked out this website, definitely check it out. I think it's like researchops.community, something like that. Just Google that. They have a lot of tools, and you can see that a lot of UX researchers are now thinking of themselves as research operations specialists. So not just doing great research, but also facilitating good research at companies. And some of them almost kind of become the librarian of the company's knowledge. I think this is a really cool emerging kind of title and role. And it goes along with this great knowledge management tool stuff that's been developing. I think this week, the Maze research company, user research company, they came out with this continuous research report trends to watch in 2023. And I was actually pretty surprised at this. I teach UX research. I teach a course on continuous UX research. And it's always been a pretty niche thing that product teams want. They want to start doing more research. But then to see like a company like Maze really putting this in the forefront of their trends report was super interesting to me. And that happened just this week. So like looking at a lot of these things that are changing, I think there's also some really great books, like Inspired came out about 10 years ago. And then Teresa Torres' book, Continuous Discovery Habits, really helped us like learn how to do some of this weekly research. Sometimes you're calling it continuous discovery, product discovery, whatever you want to call it, but trying to do more research every single week. You see this as something that's happening in a lot of places. And I'm also, I'd be curious if you put in the chat other places where you've seen stuff like this, collaboration, kind of decentralized teams working, in like smaller packets. Like, I think this is something that we're seeing in a lot of places in software. So I think that's why now there's a lot of technologies behind this. So I wanted to quickly go over some of the methods. We won't have time to get to too much, but how to do it. I don't think a lot of people offer a lot of guidance on how to do weekly research. I teach this course, Continuous UX Research, and teaching teams and lots of research professionals how to do weekly research, how to set up a system. And I think that's really the key difference between how we thought about research before, is now we're thinking about research in systems. So what is our continuous research system? Ideally, it's something where we can have it set up, it's ready to go. The users kind of waltz into it, they find it on the website, they find it wherever we're trying to attract them, and then out comes these inspirations, opportunities, and insights, and the whole team can access it. That's the kind of system that we talk about building. And I think it's like the team's knowledge management system in a sense. And let's look really quickly. I don't have a lot of time here, but I want to talk really quickly about what's made up in the system. And I go into more detail in that talk if you go to the bit.ly in the bottom left. So there are 4 areas that we teach to set up a continuous research system. The top one being automated recruitment. That's a really important one. This is what sucks all your time out. So there's lots of tools that are actually solving that, especially Airtime. That's one of their main focuses, I think, part of their feature sets. You want to have that setup already done so that you just check your calendar and it says, hey, you've got a user interview this week. You don't have to do anything about it. That does take some setup, but once it's done, that makes things much easier. So I think that's a big part of it. That way you don't have to spend a lot of time trying to find the right people to talk to. They find you. Then, of course, there's continuous methods. Which methods are we doing in the system? Then there's the knowledge management. What are we doing with the learnings that we get? And then there's collaborative synthesis. And this is kind of the fancy word for how are we getting people involved so they can learn and make decisions. So when I said bring people to look at the data, have that be something that they use to make their decisions, that's something called collaborative synthesis. And that's kind of a part of the process that a lot of researchers miss, I think, where you're bridging between I did the research, I gathered it, now so what? What do I do with it? And that's something that I think with these four things taken together, you have a pretty good system where you just show up for the fun stuff. You show up, you chat to the customer, you run the method, whatever it is, and you've got the system to deal with it after, and you've got the system to turn it into good decisions. So that's really where we focus on in the course, and we're finding that a lot of teams are actually getting a lot more research done. So really quickly, I would like you to put in the chat a UX research method. So don't say interviews or surveys. Try and come up with another one. So I want to see some examples of some UX research methods, because I know there's some UX researchers here in the chat. I've been seeing some interesting things coming up. Put a UX research method in the chat. I'll give that a second. Okay, fly on the wall. That's a good one. Contextual inquiry. Expert review. And if you have a link to these, feel free to throw it in the chat. I think it's always helpful to know. Diary method. So as these are coming in the chat, I want you to look at these methods. Do you think your developers could take part in these methods? I think maybe with a little work, a little setup, you could get your developers involved. And I mentioned developers just because they're usually like the least skilled in that. That's not always the case, but a lot of times they're the ones who are like, it better be good, it better be quick, I don't have a lot of time, and you want to make sure it's a good experience for them. Cool, thanks for putting some links as well, Martin. Competitive analysis, that's a good one. I think we'll talk very briefly about that. Card sorting, heat maps, Wizard of Oz, yeah, longitudinal studies. Tree testing, okay, great. Keep those coming in, and while they're coming in, I want you to think of your UX research method, the one that you put in the chat, or the one that you like the most, whatever it is, just keep that UX research method in your mind. Okay, so let's take that UX research method and let's see if we can be kind of constrained a little bit. I'm going to give you some constraints, and that'll make you be creative to think, how can I make this into a continuous method? How can I make this into something I can do every single week? So the 3 pillars of continuous research methods. So I created this framework because it really helps our students transfer what they already know about UX research methods and make it into something that can be a little bit more weekly and continuous. So the first thing, here's a check. So quick, that's the first pillar. So in your mind, imagine, can you run this method every week without burning out? So can you do that method in a week? The thing you put in the chat, the thing in your mind, can you do it in a week? Can you do it every week without burning out? that's a good check to see if this is a good continuous research method. Because if it's something that you won't burn you out, something that recharges you, something you can manage in your time, that's one that you're going to keep doing. Like anything, when you want to get back in shape, it's like doing it every single week that's more important. So you don't want to burn out. You don't want to go too hard. You don't want to go too little. And you want to make some adjustments till it feels right. And the quick ones are much better at that. Eventually, you can get a little bit more advanced, but I think it's good, especially when you're beginning, to start off quick. That's the first pillar. Okay, keep that same method in mind. Collaborative. Can you run this method with the entire team, even the developers? Ask yourself that. Can you run this method with the entire team, even developers? And maybe also think, like, what would change? So how could I make it where it is collaborative? And you can start to think, okay, how can I get a little creative with how I run this research method? Okay, last pillar, accessible. Can your team join the activity or access the data without help? So is it easy for them to join? Do you have to personally invite them and give them, authorization codes for all the tools you're using? That's not accessible. Do you have to make them dive through 72 pages of a research report to find the thing they actually need? I wouldn't say that's accessible either. I would hope they can actually do a quick search and find that thing. So is it accessible? So let's take just a regular old thing. Let's take something, let's take a method that many of you might do. I think this is a good way to get started with weekly research, desk research. So let's apply these 3 pillars to desk research. So desk research, it's finding already existing data. It's not creating new data. It's called secondary research. So it's a great thing you can do between meetings, and I mentioned that one. So how would I make desk research quick, collaborative, and accessible? Well, if I got a little bit creative, I could definitely make this into something quick, collaborative, and accessible. So there's something we do called time box research rounds. And what I like about this is it helps you avoid research wormholes, which is a very powerful force that makes you kind of think, oh, this is interesting, but it's not actually good for the project. So it's goal-focused, time-bound, and there's some social pressure. That's why this works really well. So it's basically Pomodoro applied to desk research. So you've got your desk research happening. Maybe you're doing it together alone. So you're all doing it for 25 minutes, and then you take a break. 5 minutes, maybe even chat a little bit about what you're learning, stand up, talk about it, see how it's going, then get back down and doing some research. So then after four times, you do a longer 20-minute break. So just a little bit of creativity there, and you can make that quick and collaborative. Accessible, also, that's something you'd have to work on. We love using Miro to share our research at the Fountain Institute and also in our courses. Also, sometimes people are using FigJam, whatever whiteboard tool they like. But this is an example of a data wall. So we call these data walls research walls, graffiti walls, whatever you want to call them. So as you're doing your desk research in your time box research round, then you can be putting it here. You can all be choosing a little section. So like, there's my section, put all my learnings there. There's your section, you put all your learnings there. This is the way that we can make it accessible. It's not amazing. It's not like a searchable research repository, but if you're doing this 25 minutes, 5 minutes, do something quick. So make sure it's quick. It's not perfect, but it's quick, it's collaborative, and it's accessible. So there's a quick example of how you might use this, the 3 pillars of continuous research methods. I've got a whole article that I'm linking to there that talks about other examples, things you might do. But I hope that's a good way to get you started. There are many other methods you could use, but I think at the end of the day, it also should feel a little bit different. When you're doing these continuously, when you're doing it weekly, it does feel a little bit different. And I also want to end here by talking about what is that feeling? What are we really going for? So it might go from really intense research to really lightweight. Okay, it might be a kind of a new extreme you're dealing with is the lightweight. You might go from sporadic, maybe you're doing some UX research maybe for 3 months out of the year, to doing a little bit throughout the whole year. So from sporadic to always on. We might go from being expert-led to participant-led. You might need to be more of a facilitator of research because those developers need to learn how to ask good interview questions, for instance. So you might be training them a little bit. Your role might become more of an educator. Project planning is hopefully reduced to just kind of a one-time setup so that things are good to go and automated. And those quarterly projects can become weekly rituals. And I think this is really important, is to think about how can we do this every single week? What's the ritual involved here? And the nice thing about rituals is we just do them. They become second nature. And then rather than interview scripts with really specific, long, like drawn out things, we could maybe be talking about discussion guides. So discussion guides just kind of guide multiple discussions, and they're kind of broad and they kind of serve whatever product we're working on, and we keep those out. So it's a little bit more evergreen. Long horizon outputs. So rather than going super far in advance, we might not be able to go that far in advance. We might have to be doing just-in-time inspiration for what we're working on this week. Project-specific recruitment to automated recruitment. It's really important to try and automate the difficult stuff. The presentation of insights might become a searchable research repository. I think this is happening in general to almost all UX researchers. And then research reports may not be as needed because you don't have to report everything if the team is the one doing the research. If you're guiding the team in the research and they're watching that pain as the customer tries to use that thing, they don't need to be as much presented those results. So this is kind of how it might change. Of course, that might be something that's still developing in your company, could take some time. You might not want to start off with 3 hours here. You might just want to start off with 1. So just take that 1 user interview, do a team debrief afterwards, and say that's where we're starting. People like Teresa Torres recommend starting there. They say if you do 1 customer interview a week, then lots of other good things will follow. And I also agree. I've seen this happen. So I hope that's enough to get you started in weekly research. This is just an overview of some of the background thinking, and I hope it was inspiring. And mainly, I hope that you go out and try it. Any of you here can be the one leading the weekly research efforts. I don't think with this more lightweight approach, always-on approach, it's a little bit more accessible to everyone, not just the really good UX research specialists. So I think it's something we could all start trying to do. And in the end, I hope it helps us make better decisions. So thanks a lot.